Some of the factors could be biologic reasons for why these cancers could be more aggressive, as well as genetic factors that could be driving the development of these more aggressive cancers. I think one of the biggest factors is screening impacting the more aggressive nature of these cancers, or perhaps more late stage identification of these cancers.
Hello and welcome to Washington Post Live. I'm Frances Stead Sellers, Associate Editor here at the Post. Today we have two new segments in our Chasing Cancer series, and later we'll hear from Dr. Steven Rosenberg, National Cancer Institute. But first, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Vida Giri, who comes to us from Yale, where she runs the Early Onset Cancer Program, and Rebecca Siegel from the American Cancer Society, where she runs the Cancer Surveillance Research. A very warm welcome to you both.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Rebecca, if I may, I'd love to start with you. The American Cancer Society has just released this new report on breast cancer, which you do every so often. What are the big takeaways from this current report?
So, the big takeaways are that we're excited to report a continuing decline in breast cancer mortality of 44% since 1989. And this is because of advances in treatment as well as, of course, screening. But we also found some concerning news in that breast cancer incidence rates are continuing to increase, and those increases are steeper in women younger than 50 and in those who are Asian or Pacific Islander.
So that's a very mixed report, which really takes me to you, Vida, to ask about these early onset cancers. What do we know? Why are we seeing this pattern of early onset in a disease that we used to think of as one of old age?
Yes, it's a really important question. We get asked why. This is a very frequent question that we get asked, and it's not fully clear as to why these cancers are on the rise. We actually see that it's cancers across the spectrum that are on the rise, with the greatest incidence being colorectal cancer and breast cancer. It's likely going to be multifactorial in terms of thinking of environmental exposures, changes through the generations in terms of lifestyle, diet, and then maybe some genetic underpinnings too, in terms of the drivers for why we're seeing these increasing rates of early onset cancers.
Just to follow up on that, are they actually more aggressive than other cancers, or is it just that young people's bodies are different when they do get cancers?
Yes, I mean, there again, too, I think we see a spectrum in terms of aggressiveness. Some individuals do have aggressive cancer at a younger age, and really understanding what are the biologic drivers of those aggressive cancers is critical so that we can tailor treatments appropriately based on the disease behavior. Other individuals, it may not necessarily be aggressive, but when we look at outcomes for these patients, we have to keep in mind things like secondary cancers or consequences of therapies that could occur years down the road. And so we have to keep various different outcomes in mind.
And just before I come back to you, Rebecca, Vida, I would like to ask you as well, do they require a different type of treatment, a different approach to treatment from cancers for older people?
Again, very open question in terms of thinking of what are the optimal ways to help with treatments for these individuals with young onset cancers. I think there's a big need to enroll younger individuals in clinical trials to help, delineate that question. For the most part, what we do know is that these individuals really similar to a lot of the cancer population is thinking about multidisciplinary care, where we are engaging with experts across the care spectrum for the care of these patients and really bringing in a lot of the psychosocial care that's necessary to help these patients engage and go through their cancer treatments and beyond into survivorship.
Thank you. Rebecca, I want to come and ask you a little bit about disparities in these issues because we've talked broadly about drops in rates of death from breast cancer, for example, but those aren't across the board, right? And there are some fairly stunning numbers that perhaps you can help me understand in terms of which groups are enjoying those benefits and which are not, where those drops are not showing.
Yes, exactly. Very, very concerning. The Native American population, I feel personally, doesn't get the attention it deserves in terms of cancer disparities, in part because they are a small group. But one astounding finding that we report is that despite the overall drop of 44% in breast cancer mortality, among Native American women specifically, there's been no progress whatsoever. And
Mm.
Native American women are also the least likely to be screened for breast cancer. And so these are very concerning disparities that need to be addressed and can be addressed in part through greater access to high quality screening and cancer treatment.
Yeah, go a little bit more into some of the factors that can explain these disparities, and also just briefly how we might address those gaps in equality, those gaps in care.
Sure. I would also like to add the other large disparity that we report year over year is the large gap in breast cancer mortality for Black women who
Right.
actually have lower breast cancer incidence than white women, as do Native American women, but higher breast cancer mortality. And for Black women, it's 38% higher. So, an enormous gap that has been stagnant for decades. And so the what we know more about the black disparity because there's been a lot more research, but across the continuum from lower quality mammograms to a longer time between an abnormal mammogram and a follow up exam, and then longer delays between a diagnosis and beginning treatment for Black women. And so there are many places along that continuum of care where the ball is dropped for many minority groups. And again, I think it just comes down to improving access to high quality care from screening to treatment.
Thank you. Vida, Rebecca has just shown very clearly huge disparities within this country. I want to ask you more specifically about this odd pattern we now have of early onset cancers, and whether you see the same pattern in other countries. Is this an American story or a universal developed world story or a universal story around the globe?
Right. I think we are seeing these trends globally as well. For sure, we see the national data that's been reported. It is continuing to be reported, but we absolutely see these trends in developed countries around the world, and we have been noting them in under-resourced countries as well for quite some time. It's really important to think about what Rebecca's bringing to the table here about what are the disparities all the way on the continuum of care, and then how can resources either be allocated or used appropriately in various countries and various communities to be able to address from the screening aspect all the way to engagement in care and treatment and beyond.
You mentioned diet earlier on, Vida, and I'd like to follow up on that. We've had a lot of audience questions asking about ultra-processed foods. Do you see a link between ultra-processed foods and early onset cancers, or is it too soon to tell?
Yeah, it is too soon to tell, but what we really want to focus on is that healthy diet and lifestyle, really bringing that back to the forefront in terms of thinking about whether it's for early onset cancer or for overall health in general. It's really important to keep in mind, factors that are have been either shown to be associated with cancer reduction or really improvement in overall health. So those sort of heart healthy diet patterns and factors, physical activity, and really engaging in those healthy lifestyle choices are really factors that we're working on very well, much so in terms of promoting awareness for our patients and in our communities, as well as talking about how can we think about screening at a younger age? Is that appropriate for certain individuals?
And again, another topic we've heard an awful lot about from our readers is microplastics, forever chemicals. Is it too early to tell, or do we have any link now between these early onset cancers and plastics, microplastics?
I know, right? It's such a good question, and really at this point, there's a lot of work that's going on to try to get at some estimates of are they associated, and if so, what's the contribution of risk? Is it earlier? Is it cancer in general? Some intriguing data that was recently published was looking at generational trends in early onset cancers, looking at, say, the Gen X versus the baby boomers and generations before. And does that give us some insights into thinking about what may have changed over these generations that could be potentially connected to or even explored for association to early onset cancers?
So, Rebecca, let me come to you, because it seems to me that one of the ways we discover cancers is through screenings. But of course, young people are often excluded from screenings, or they're not suggested for young people. Tell us how that fits into your understanding of early onset cancers and what your feeling now is about screening, Rebecca.
So, the age to begin screening is a delicate balance because you don't want to be screening a large population that has a very low risk of cancer because there are harms to screening. But I think where the focus needs to be is to increase the screening numbers because right now only 20% of people 45 to 49 are being screened for colorectal cancer. And that number is way too low when we're seeing increasing incidence rates with every successive generation. And in addition to that, one thing that's very important is for everyone to talk to their doctor about when they should start screening because about 30% of colorectal cancer patients should have begun screening earlier than 45 because they have a family history or something that makes them at higher risk. And we know that diagnosing disease earlier improves outcomes. Localized stage breast cancer has a 99% survival rate, and for colorectal cancer, it's 90%. So, really boosting those screening rates in especially in the young population where we see these increasing incidence rates could make a big difference.
So, Rebecca, a follow up on that. Some forms of screening, like a colonoscopy, are routine at a certain age, but they're fairly invasive. Should we be looking at other forms of screening, like, for example, stool samples, where you can deliver to a large number of people more cheaply and see the results?
Exactly. And I think that's the sweet spot for young patients because it's less invasive, it's more convenient, it's less expensive, and all of these factors are important for the younger population and they are at lower risk. And so using stool testing in patients in their 40s would really be a way, I think, to increase screening. We know that these tests are proven to reduce mortality. The only piece of that is that they have to be done more regularly than a colonoscopy, and they also have to be followed up with a colonoscopy if the test is positive. And so there are more pieces of the pie that can be dropped if you're doing stool testing, but I think it should be emphasized more, and doctors should be talking about the option of stool testing to their younger patients, especially. We also know, though, that people, for example, who are Hispanic are much more likely to screen if they're offered stool testing. And so, for all of these reasons, I think that we have been pushing colonoscopy because it's the gold standard, but I think that it's really the test that gets done is the best test for each individual.
Good message, the test that gets done. But Vida, I heard that word loud and clear. Harms can come from testing. We all know you can get false positives. You can get led into all sorts of expensive medical testing. Tell us the balance when it comes to young people from your experience, from your center. How do you figure this out?
Yes, it really is that balance, having a as much as possible individualized or personalized approach based on risk. And so, really thinking about what is a young person's risk of developing cancer becomes kind of the central question. And there are sort of two key pieces of information that we can think about for this in terms of estimate of risk, one of which is family history, as was just noted. Having a family history, particularly of close blood relatives like mother, sister, who have had specific cancers, for example, let's say breast cancer or colorectal cancer, really could be informative for thinking about the person's risk of their own development of cancer. But also thinking of family history more broadly, both sides of the family, mother's side and father's side, and thinking of all of the blood relatives and all of across the cancer spectrum, because cancers can be connected in various different ways. That family history information can help guide age to start cancer screening, but also thinking of genetic testing. So, genetic testing is one of the key modalities that could be helpful for estimating a person's risk of development of cancer, and also then guiding what age to start cancer screening. Some of them, with the genes that we test for today, we would even recommend starting some of the screenings in a person's 20s. So it just really depends on the person's individualized cancer risk to think about the screening questions that we might want to bring forth for that patient.
Rebecca, I'd like to come back to you because you've talked a lot about disparities. And of course, navigating the healthcare system can be very, very tricky for people. Even with the best health insurance, this is a daunting process if you have a diagnosis like cancer or want to get screened for a cancer. Could you talk to us about how that system, and of course, it's a different system for different people, can work or can be embraced by people to make it work for them? It's a huge question, but what advice can you give people about how to move ahead through this very, very difficult system?
Absolutely. Patient navigation is an important aspect of that. And I think we're seeing more and more utilization of patient navigation at the American Cancer Society. We have programs, and we are really pushing because we've seen that this can make a difference, because the healthcare system is very challenging to navigate. Even if you are a high SCS patient, who I've seen people who are in the health profession get a diagnosis and struggle to get that continuity of care. And so I think that just talking to your doctor, your primary care physician, who's that gatekeeper who can help you navigate the system, and then asking for any help that there might be in patient navigation.
We're getting close to the end of our time, but Vida, I'd like to come back to you to ask you about how to get these messages out without increasing fear or stigma, which seem to be enormous problems, particularly for young people.
Yes, that's really true. It's a big focus of our program here at Yale Cancer Center, the Early Onset Cancer Program, where we're really trying to get the message out about empowerment. How can we empower individuals to learn some information that might be helpful to know their risk of cancer, and then what they can do about that with that information? For example, knowing your family history of cancer. We're also working on programs to help with the navigation, as was just mentioned, because individuals really need help in this space with all of the responsibilities that they have when they're diagnosed with a cancer between the ages of 18 to 49. So we are really focusing on navigation efforts for our patients that have early onset cancers, and also their families and caregivers who are also going through this journey with them and deal with a lot of challenges. And I can't emphasize enough the importance of thinking of the disparities in this whole continuum. So with our program at Yale, we have disparities front and center as we're developing our models for navigation, clinical research, and really cancer awareness.
Cancer awareness and navigation is a word I'm really going to take away from this conversation. Thank you both very much for joining us. Rebecca and Vida, thank you for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you so
Thank
much
you
for
very
having
much.
me.
And I will be back shortly with Dr. Stephen Rosenberg from the National Cancer Institute, so please don't go away.
My name is Angie Reed. I was diagnosed with an esthesioneuroblastoma. The Proton Center is a pretty special place.
I'm most excited about the potential to eradicate and eliminate cancer. The burden of cancer is real, and our research and our efforts here can help everyone.
My doctors have instilled the confidence in me that my life is going to continue down the path that I've always envisioned.
Colorectal cancers are the fourth most common type of cancer and will affect over 150,000 Americans in 2024. Cancer specialists are seeing a concerning rise of this disease in younger patients. Joining me to discuss what we need to know about colorectal cancers and treatments in younger individuals are Dr. Otis Brawley, Associate Director, Community Outreach and Engagement at Johns Hopkins Kimmel Cancer Center, and Dr. Valerie Lee, Assistant Professor of Oncology at Johns Hopkins Kimmel Cancer Center. Welcome to the both of you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Dr. Brawley, there have been many studies and discussions about the increase in colorectal cancers in younger individuals. What are the national trends and demographics of these patients?
Yes, in terms of incidence, we've seen a doubling of the incidence of colorectal cancer amongst Americans aged 35 to 50. Literally, 10% used to be diagnosed below the age of 50 in the 1990s. Today, it's 20%. This rise has also been associated with an increased risk of death among people aged 35 to 50. This is especially concerning because we've had a halving of the death rate from colorectal cancer in the entire population from 1980 to today. Think of this, we've got a 50% decline in death rate for the entire population, but an increase in the death rate for people aged 35 to 50. We see it in all races. We see it in people who live in rural areas, people who live in urban areas, people who are rich, people who are poor. And the other interesting thing is this is an American trend. We're not seeing this amongst the populations in Western Europe. And so it's something to be very concerned about and try to figure out what is causing this as well as how we can best deal with it.
Yeah, I guess the next most pressing question then is why are we seeing this trend, particularly in younger patients? What factors might be involved here?
Unfortunately, right now, we don't have a definitive answer as to why this is happening. We have some theories. It's been noted that in 1970, 15% of our population was obese. Today, it's well over 40%. The increase in obesity is the cause of a number of cancers. There's at least a dozen cancers, including colorectal cancer, which is linked to weight gain and obesity. Consumption of too many calories, not enough exercise, and storing that caloric energy as obesity. We worry that our use of antibiotics, and we've overused antibiotics over the last several decades in the American population, especially amongst kids, may have changed the bacterial flora, the bacteria in the gut, and this might have led to an increased propensity for colorectal cancer. We also worry about things like processed foods. Processed foods are carcinogenic. They're on the World Health Organization's list of things that can cause cancer. We may have changed the American diet such that we're causing younger people to have more of these malignancies.
Yeah. Dr. Lee, over to you. Talk to me about the younger patients you're seeing and how they differ from older patients who have been screened.
So, of course, and I think as Dr. Brawley referenced, we are seeing people of all races and genders. And in the area that I treat, which I work in DC, we're seeing a lot of very healthy individuals who don't have any predisposing conditions. But the difference between our younger patients and maybe somebody who's in their 50s or 60s is across the board, they're financially or socioeconomically in a different place. They might be starting new jobs or partway into their careers and have less savings. And this is a group that's oftentimes potentially caring for young children and or their parents as well. Notably, from a biological perspective, we also see more advanced or aggressive disease. And part of it is that we're not screening these patients. So we're not finding the asymptomatic cases. And also that symptoms are often mistaken by both the person having them as well as the medical teams for something more benign. The number of times I've heard about people having thought they had hemorrhoids and really end up unfortunately being rectal cancer is unfortunately pretty high. We also think that biologically there is something that's different that could have triggered the development of the cancer in a younger patient. And we also think more about a genetic predisposition in this group of patients, and we want to do genetic testing. But thankfully, outcomes are the same, if not better, probably because we are more aggressive in their care.
Let's talk about those outcomes. How are you managing younger patients' treatments? And again, how is this different from older patients?
So, unfortunately, a lot of our standard of care treatments, which usually involve chemotherapy, are pretty still standard across the board. But with personalized medicine and developing profiling, we might be able to go and think about more advances that might personalize these treatments for each of for everybody. But overall, what we can be is that we generally can be more aggressive in our care for younger patients who might not have as many other medical conditions or may have some more reserve to go and handle the treatments we give them. But we also want to balance that against the fact that, especially in the people that we are curing, that we are hoping for many, many, many more decades of life, and their quality of life is really important. And one big example is in the care for people with localized rectal cancer. It usually requires a combination of three different therapies. So, radiation to the pelvis, and that can potentially cause a lot of dysfunction to the surrounding organs. Surgery, which could involve a temporary or permanent ostomy, and chemotherapy, which can cause long term effects. And the ones that I give can potentially cause long term neuropathy, which is numbness and tingling in the hands and feet. And while we're hoping to cure everybody in this group, we also want to think about that long term quality of life. Again, this is true across any age group, but for a younger patient, maybe we're thinking about their fertility preservation and we want to involve our fertility groups very early on, or think about surgeries to move the ovaries out of the way in a young woman who maybe wants to prevent early menopause. Also, over the past decade, we've really been transforming the care and thinking maybe we don't need to do all three of these treatments and maybe we can avoid radiation or avoid surgery, avoid chemo. We've also had advances where we're testing everybody, but really thinking about whether or not other treatments like immunotherapy might be an option. But for the younger patients, we are also very mindful of the fact that we need to do early genetic testing to go and see, do they carry anything that predisposes them to developing cancer? Because this might not just affect them, but also affect their families as well.
Well, it's no exaggeration to say that the rising rate of colorectal cancer in younger Americans is an alarming trend. So, thank you both for putting a spotlight on it and the potential contributing factors and prevention insights. Now, back to the Washington Post.
Almost half of all patients with the most aggressive of the lymphomas, the diffuse large B-cell lymphomas, as well as children with acute lymphocytic leukemia, we can get response rates near 70–80% with durable, complete elimination of all of the cancer in about half of patients. So it represents, I think, an important step for those patients. We now need to learn how to apply that same principle to the solid cancers that are the big killers.
Hello and welcome back to Washington Post Live. For those of you just joining us, I'm Frances Steed Sellers, an associate editor here at the Post. And I am now delighted to be joined by Dr. Steven Rosenberg from the National Cancer Institute, where he is chief of the surgery branch and where he's served for the past 50 years. So Dr. Rosenberg, a very warm welcome to Washington Post Live.
Good to be here.
Well, thank you for joining us. We had a little bit about immunotherapy in that opening, but give us the layman's rundown of what immunotherapy is all about and how it works at its comparative advantages against surgery, chemo, and radiation, which are the standard treatments we think of.
Well, we've had for a long time the three major treatments for cancer, and that is surgery, over 3,000 years old, discussed in the Egyptian papyri. We've had radiation therapy since the discovery of X-rays in 1895. Chemotherapy is quite recent. has been first noted during the biological warfare efforts during the Second World War, when laboratory workers were accidentally exposed to nitrogen mustard. That became a chemotherapy drug, melphalan, and we date, therefore, chemotherapy to the 1940s. Immunotherapy is very new. The first effective treatment for patients with any kind of cancer, a melanoma, using immunotherapy was in 1984, when a substance called interleukin-2 was used here at the National Cancer Institute to treat patients with melanoma. The immunotherapy varies from other treatments. We don't use scalpels or radiation beams or drugs. We try to take advantage of the body's own natural immune resistance to cancer. The body recognizes a cancer as foreign, but not foreign enough to eliminate it. And the goal of immunotherapy is to stimulate those natural immune reactions to cause the cancer to disappear. And we're making progress.
It's very
The
good to get. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
treatment of patients with melanoma, for example, when we started this before the advent of interleukin-2 and the use of a patient's own cells for treatment, would have a 5-year survival when it had metastasized from the local site of 5 to 10%. Now it's over 50%. So for
Wow.
certain kinds of cancers, immunotherapy has become a dominant force in this battle against cancer.
And melanoma being a very, very dangerous form of skin cancer. Your conversation is provoking a lot of questions from the audience already, and I'd like to go to one right away. It comes from Peggy Townsend from Michigan. And Peggy says, what types of cancer can now be treated with immunotherapy? So you mentioned melanoma, but tell us a little bit more broadly about what kinds of cancers are the target for these new treatments.
Well, we're working hard at the National Cancer Institute to extend the influence of immunotherapy and its applicability to a wide variety of cancers. Right now, FDA approval exists for treatment for patients with melanoma, for patients with renal cancer, and for a variety of hematologic cancers. Just a few years ago, the FDA approved cell therapies, that is, using a patient's own genetically modified cells that were taken out of the body, genetically modified to recognize the cancer and given back. And that approval just occurred in 2017. So lymphomas and leukemias can be effectively treated. But those are only the approved treatments. We now understand that the overwhelming majority of cancers are recognized by the immune system. That is, lymphocytes that are the warriors of the immune system that we all have circulating in our body. Every milliliter thimbleful of blood contains 1 million lymphocytes that can potentially react against foreign invaders. And we now understand that about 80% of all patients do have T cells, T lymphocytes that can recognize the cancer. Approaches that take them out of the body, identify the most active ones, and then give them back under appropriate conditions where they can manifest their activity, are now being seen for a variety of the solid cancers like breast cancer, even colon cancer, pancreatic cancer. And so a great deal of progress is being made, but examples do exist that it can work in those cancers. And when you know something can work, you at least have the nucleus of information that you can use to try to improve upon it, and those efforts are taking place around the world.
Dr. Rosenberg, you referred to this cellular therapy for metastatic melanoma. I want to quote you back to yourself because you told the Washington Post it's the start of a new era in the development of a new approach to treating cancer. Those are pretty exciting words. You were quoted saying that some time ago. Do you still feel that? Are you even more excited about the potential?
Well, I'm even more excited because of the recent developments that have taken place. For example, we finally understand what are the targets of the immune system that can be approached. What are cancer antigens that can be recognized by T cells? And we now recognize that it's the very genetic changes that cause the cancer in the first place, called mutations, that are the targets of almost all immunotherapies. And now that we know what the target is, we can take steps to more directly develop approaches to actually attack those very targets. So in the most recent of immunotherapies, called cellular therapy, we use a patient's own immune cells to treat the patient. We take the cells out of the body. We can manipulate them genetically to insert into them receptors that can recognize the cancer. We can identify the very rare cells that exist within a tumor that are doing battle against the cancer, purify them, and re-administer them under conditions in which they can actually enter the cancer and attack it. So there's a great deal of progress being made along a variety of fronts, but it's the cellular therapy that I think has the greatest future.
These advances, this progress you're talking about is generating a lot of questions from our readers. I have another question. This one comes from Deborah Ferguson in Arizona with a very good question. Deborah asks, are patients ever considered cured after immunotherapy, or does the treatment just delay recurrence? Interesting.
Well, in melanoma, there's very little question that it can be curative. The first patient that was ever treated with an immunotherapy, interleukin-2, that we treated here at the NCI in 1984, is still alive and free of disease now, over 40 years later. She came to us with widespread melanoma, received an immune-stimulating substance, interleukin-2. The cancer disappeared over the course of about 6 months and has never returned. We have a breast cancer patient that's now a disease that had widespread disease, that's now disease-free over 6 years later, a colon cancer patient, similarly with that kind of results. It can result in durable regressions. Now, before you talk about cure, you're talking about the lifespan of an individual. So at least in renal cell cancer and melanoma, we know 30, 40 years later, patients are disease-free and very likely cured. When we've only followed patients for 5 to 10 years, then we have to wait a little longer to find out whether or not it'll ever occur.
Right. Dr. Rosenberg, you are a pioneer in these fields. You've been at it for 50 years, and I'd love it if you would take us back into kind of the origin story. When did you get a hunch that you could use a person's own immune system to tackle this problem that's been with us since mankind began?
Well, you can learn a lot from the careful observation of patients, listening to what they say. And I saw 2 patients early in my career as a surgical resident at the Brigham Hospital in Boston. One was a patient that had a metastatic melanoma that disappeared in the absence of any treatment. He had widespread disease, and I was following him, and his cancer went away. That's one of the rarest events in medicine, the spontaneous regression of a cancer in the absence of any treatment. But that, in fact, indicates that there's something in the body that enabled multiple deposits of cancer to be attacked. A second example was a patient that was seen just before I arrived as an intern. It was a patient who had received a kidney transplant. The Brigham was just starting to perform those from one individual to another. A kidney was obtained from a young boy who died in a motorcycle accident. His cancer was transplanted into a patient, and a few months later, that patient, the recipient, started developing widespread cancer, and it turned out to be a kidney cancer. Inadvertently, the cancer that had been transplanted contained a malignancy, unbeknownst to the transplant surgeons. Well, the patient was undergoing immunosuppressive treatment to keep the kidney alive. When that immunosuppressive treatment was removed, the cancer that had spread throughout that patient also disappeared. And so what that said is, if you could stimulate a strong enough immune reaction, such as the one allogeneic reaction from one patient to another that results in the transplantation of organs, if you could effectively treat a metastatic bulky cancer that way, that indicated that the search for an immunotherapy approach was at least possible. And it was those 2 examples that set me on this path over 50 years ago to try to develop effective immunotherapies. And we now have at least 3 that we've developed that have been approved by the Food and Drug Administration.
It's just very exciting to hear. I'd love to hear what people said when you first made these connections and how you advanced the science. Did you get straight to NIH or?
Well, I came to the NIH in 1974, and at that point, there was no immunotherapy that existed for cancer. There was no knowledge that there was such a thing as a cancer antigen or even an immune response against the cancer. And so there was a lot of pushback against efforts and money that was being put into research for immunotherapy. But after the treatment of the first 66 patients that we treated with our new way to stimulate cells within the body to reject the cancer, we finally saw that one patient, the 67th patient who received this interleukin 2, who had a complete regression of her disease that has been long lasting. Before you've seen something work, you don't know if it will ever work. But once you have examples of it working, now you have a basis upon which to develop improvements. And that's occurred quite rapidly in melanoma and now being extended to many other kinds of cancers, And we're working around the clock still as our
I can't
organizations
resist
around the world.
asking. So you have these beginnings of answers, or answers, indeed answers, at the NIH. And then there's this next step into the real world, into scaling these responses. Tell me a little bit about that process, how it moves from the rarefied atmosphere of the NIH into the real world.
Well, there are academic institutions such as the NIH that are doing research in immunotherapy, but these academic institutions can't bring the treatments to widespread use. So it's observations that's made in academic basic science laboratories that are doing the experiments that, when shown to be effective, can then be picked up by commercial companies. And that's what's actually happened with immunotherapy, especially the cellular immunotherapies, which are highly individual. We create a new drug for every patient. Effective cancer therapies are very likely to be highly personalized. And when we first develop a way to take a patient's own cells out of their body, genetically modify them and give them back and cause cancer regression, at first people didn't believe it. Then, as we continue to find good responses, the genius of American industry figured out ways to develop that. And in fact, now you can, if you develop a certain kind of lymphoma, for example, send your lymphocytes to a central facility. They will genetically modify them and return them back to the hospital for administration. And that's happening now on a daily basis for the treatment of certain kinds of blood cancers.
So what do you see as the greatest roadblock now, if you're trying to think about the big question of curing cancer?
Well, biology is very complex. The immune system, the body itself, has developed over the 4.5 billion years that we think life existed on this planet. And with environmental changes, genetic changes then occurred in living things to enable them to survive these environmental changes. And so one complexity built on another and then on another, and until it's become a very redundant, complex system. You can't understand biology from basic principles. You have to get in the laboratory, do experiments, learn how the immune system works. And the more you learn, the better you are able to develop approaches to certain diseases, and certainly cancer is one of them. My prediction is that the immunotherapy approaches that are now being developed are the ones that are going to result in the greatest improvements in the ability to cure cancer over the next decade.
Which takes me to a question about vaccines. This question comes from the audience, and I think when we think back to the pandemic, we all got a very basic lessons in immunology and vaccine science. But Marie Fambre, who's writing to us from California, says, when will cancer vaccines be available in the US? And I think we need to step back a little bit from that and have a quick overview of which those vaccines are. When will they be available? What's the stage of production?
Well, vaccines have had a dramatic and extraordinary impact on human health because they can stimulate antibodies, that is, circulating small molecules that can interact with the infectious agent and destroy it. And we've seen that for a whole variety of infectious diseases. But unfortunately, despite thousands of papers that have been written attempting to develop vaccines that can either prevent or treat cancer, we basically cannot do that for today for any of the virtually any of the solid cancers. There are certain cancers caused by viruses that can be treated, but just as in infectious diseases, once you have an aggressive infectious disease, a vaccine doesn't work. They only work to prevent it by targeting the organism that caused it. Well, unfortunately, the causation of cancer are within our own cells. And so, although cancer vaccines are very attractive, they're easy to give, they don't have any side effects, but no one has figured out a way to utilize vaccines right now to treat cancer. We're dependent on the use of small molecules that can stimulate the immune system or inhibit factors that prevent the immune system from working, or we can take advantage of the body's own cellular immune system, not antibodies, but cells that we know can destroy the cancer. And it's those cellular approaches that are now paramount in our efforts to study cancer that are being undertaken around the world.
Dr. Rosenberg, I want to fit in one last question before we finish, and it's a big picture one. You've talked about advances in immunotherapy. We heard from our previous guests about early onset cancers, the rise in those cancers. We have other technologies hitting medicine very quickly, AI prime among them. When you step back, you've had this extraordinary 50-year career for which we are all very grateful. How optimistic do you feel about finding a broad cure for these range of cancers in the next, I don't know, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years? Give me the big picture answer.
Well, we know there's a commonality in cancers. Cancers that are in the solid organs that cause 90% of all deaths from cancer arise from genetic mutations that occur when cells within the organ of the body that develops the cancer develop mistakes, develop mutations. And it's the accumulation of those internal mutations within a cell that results in that cell going from a normal cell to a malignant cell. The more we understand about which mutations are involved, then the more likely we are to develop more effective treatments for it. We have very little understanding, for example, of why there is an increase in incidence of cancer, especially colon cancer in younger people, and we see that in our own practice on almost a daily basis. I think the more we understand the molecular biology, the molecular events that occur within a cell to cause a cancer, the more we'll be able to interfere with that process and hopefully someday prevent as well as cure the disease.
Dr. Rosenberg, thank you for interfering in those cells. Thank you for your pioneering work, and thank you for joining us today on Washington Post Live.
You're very welcome.
That's all we have time for today. Thank you so much for joining us on Washington Post Live. If you'd like to see more of these important conversations, please get a Washington Post subscription. And you can get a free trial by going to WashingtonPost/live, WashingtonPost.com, sorry, WashingtonPost.com/live. Thank you so much. I'm Frances Stead Sellers.